greater implementation of policies requiring mitigation and offsetting, which means that more governments are requiring that this happen. And we're also beginning to see that institutional funding is beginning to target offsets more. So there's more money becoming available and new ways of looking at financing of biodiversity offsets. And this is really useful because right now there's a lot of discussion about offsets. There's a lot of talk about financing and implementing offsets. But right now what we're seeing is a tremendous inadequacy of funding. There's the money that's available for offsets is oftentimes too little to actually achieve the no net loss and net gain that we would like to. There's also this insecurity of funding. Funding may occur for the first few years, budgets get cut from companies, there's less of a commitment to funding, and so that's a problem for the security of offsets and for the security of biodiversity. So all the risk really lies on nature because there isn't enough, how would I say, pressure or requirements to ensure that that funding is available. And then the timing of funding. Most funding, the arguments are for companies to pay for that funding for those offsets later on, rather than early in the process when we really need to have the money to make those commitments. And so what we're going to talk about a little bit today, and the panelists are going to talk about, is the potential to be able to fund protected areas that are today woefully underfunded, protected areas that are new, protected areas that are under design, and those all have potential if we could put together an effective biodiversity offset program. So whoops, my numbers here are not showing up, and I apologize for that. But basically, there's today like around 24 need for about, about $24 billion. The actual money that's available from offsets right here in this little red thing is about 7 to 8 billion. Sorry, this keeps moving. But the need today is about $68 billion. So as we can see, we need a lot more money than we really have for the current expenditure in protected areas. Now, offsets funding is very, very limited today. As I say, $6 to $7 billion. However, the study that was done by the Paulson Center said that if we look at 2030 and the possibilities for creating new protected areas and meeting the targets, we would need to have around $170 billion. They also said that the potential for offsets and financing from offsets could be in the realm of 165 million, which would really bring us a long way to actually funding the protected area needs to meet those targets that we've talked about. So that is very appealing. And I think it's a possibility that we really need to begin to look at. So I just want to indicate that I think in terms of future steps, I really believe, and a lot of our colleagues are discussing this, is that there's a potential to aggregate offsets, to place offsets inside protected areas, and possibly even set up a credit-like system so that we have units of exchange and have a value on those units, so that we know that the number of units, when exchanged as part of an offset financing deal, would result in the funding, the total funding in that protected area. to do this well, we'd have to begin to require that these payments happen prior to licensing. And as they're upfront payments, people pay their offsets. It becomes the part of the cost of doing business. And that gets paid up front, and then the project can go forward. That money then is structured as a long-term financing mechanism. And so that funding, therefore, is insured and guaranteed so that the finance of those protected areas or key biodiversity areas are done early on. And so the risk is no longer held by nature so that this funding can take place. So we believe that if we could get good programs that were really structured so that companies are doing less harm on their investments, truly paying for the cost of compensating for their impacts, we could go a long way toward meeting the 2030 targets for conservation. So we're going to have several presentations today, and one of those with Aurélien Guingand from AFD, building the foundation. Then we're going to have some case studies that will provide some examples of opportunities that fit in with some of the general guidelines that I've presented. So again, I didn't want to take much time because I wanted to have time for these case studies. And thank you very much. And I'll turn this back over to David.
Not that one. This is on the top. I opened up PowerPoint. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Well, that seemed to go pretty well. Okay, but we couldn't hear. But next up is Aurélien from AFD, and use the microphone. Relatively loudly.
Yes. Okay. All right. Good morning to all. I'm Aurélien Guingand from AFD. I'm a biodiversity project manager within the agriculture and the biodiversity division of AFD. I'm very happy to be here today in Marseille and in this CFA pavilion. We've been all waiting for this Congress for very long, so let's now make the most of it collectively and pave the way for COP15 ahead of us. Following Ray's introduction, I'd like to quickly discuss the role of a public development bank such as AFD regarding the development of the mitigation hierarchy, with a specific focus on the challenge of biodiversity offset financing as a tool to deliver conservation outcomes. First and foremost, if we collectively want to mainstream the mitigation hierarchy as a global tool for conservation finance, I think the development of legal regulations and policy guidelines at the national level remains the key challenge ahead of us and the key driver for offset requirements and financing. We estimate that over 100 countries are currently developing or already have some kind of compensation requirements by law. However, if a dozen countries worldwide do have robust regulations and guidance regarding the mitigation hierarchy, including offsets, most do not yet follow international best practices, do not fully enforce their regulations, or don't have the necessary guidelines to favor implementation. And very few countries have actual policies in place in Africa, especially. The technical and institutional support to governments and ministries for the definition of national regulations and public policies is at the core of the combo projects implemented by the Wildlife Conservation Society and its partners since 2016, and co-financed by AFD and the French Facility for Global Environment, with a total amount of 7 million euros. I'm happy to mention that phase 2 of the combo project just began in June 2021, with a total budget of 10 million euros in order to develop and reinforce the application of the mitigation hierarchy in 6 key countries, namely Guinea, Uganda, Madagascar, Mozambique, Laos, and Myanmar. However, as it is often the case, having national regulations and policies is necessary but not sufficient to achieve results on the ground. A capacity building of public authorities and civil society, the creation of interministerial platforms to favor dialogue and coherence, the development of tools and guidance for conservation and development planning, and the building of metrics to determine loss and gain of biodiversity. All of those activities to be continued in the context of combo in the different countries are key to ensure first that offsets are sufficiently anticipated and costly enough to be the last resort option when applying the mitigation hierarchy. And the second, that when offsets are needed, they are actually designed, financed, and implemented following best international practices. In addition to the support of governments for policy development regarding the mitigation hierarchy, the role of public development banks such as AFD is also to ensure compliance with best environmental and social diligences for the infrastructures projects we finance. Priority must be given to ES pre-screening to favor avoidance of impacts whenever possible. And we also need to ensure the full application of the mitigation hierarchy, including the follow-up of offsets with some contractual requirements to ensure that their financing and implementation is actually in place. Another avenue for progress from the perspective of a PDB is the mainstreaming of biodiversity into budget support programs provided by public development banks to ministries of finance in developing countries with the objective of having transformative impacts on economic and environmental public policies at the national level. There are a few examples of such budget support in Mexico, Costa Rica, and Turkey, for example, but few actual examples of such projects that directly include the development of regulations and guidelines for the application of the mitigation hierarchy. Last but not least, I'd like to say a few words on the potential of offsets as a way to complement a traditional conservation finance, such as ODA funding, in order to support, sustain, or scale up the outcomes of conservation projects over time. Indeed, given the current financing gap for biodiversity conservation at the global level, the use of public finance and ODA funding will only be a part of the solution. So first, protected areas financing has been at the core of AFD's biodiversity strategy for a long time, and the FFEM as well. A common question raised on the topic consists in wondering what a protected area will become after the end of a donor finance project, with a very strong risk for the PA of actually becoming a paper park if nothing has been planned during a project implementation. So support from public authorities, along with the use of innovative financing mechanisms such as potentially aggregated offsets, could be part of the solution. Of course, conditions and the feasibility have to be explored further. and especially in the context of the combo project, including long-term management, additionality, and the possible crowding out effect of a public budget. Second, the mitigation hierarchy overall can ensure transparent and inclusive multi-stakeholder dialogue at the territorial level on conservation and development planning, and thus improving in a way social acceptability and the sustainable management over time of both infrastructure and conservation projects. And finally, donors such as AFD often support national biodiversity policies, design and implementation through technical assistance. And there's always a resource mobilization challenge at one point. So the use of target-based compensation to contribute to species and habitat-specific NBSAPs objectives could also definitely be an opportunity to further explore in practical terms in the near future. Let me conclude here, and thank you very much for your attention, and I'm available for any questions if need be.
Thank you, Aurélien. Okay. Excellent. Thanks very much. Much better without this, I think. Next we have, you're not going to say anything, right? Okay, so next we have Fabien Quetier from Biodiversité, who will be presenting on his case studies.
Right. Thank you. So I was told to speak loudly so that you could hear me, but I guess all right. Okay, thank you. So briefly, I'm actually going to build on Aurélien's presentation of the combo project to share Biotope's experience of actually implementing this project in Guinea since 2016. And we're now looking forward to continuing our efforts there for the coming few years. For those who don't know, Guinea is a small West African country, which is basically stuck between Senegal, Liberia, and Côte d'Ivoire. It's one of the least developed countries in Africa, but it's also one of the most richly endowed in a lot of mineral resources. And so it's been living somewhat a mining boom for the past decade. So very significant flows of investment in extracting bauxite for aluminium. There are several iron ore projects in the country, and also considerable investment in hydropower to, among other things, power this industrial development. And so in this context, it's interesting for us to discuss how this private sector investment can be leveraged to address the very poor situation of the country's protected areas, which are also, as Aurélien mentioned, largely paper parks. Not only paper parks, but largely defaunated as well. So very much empty paper parks. So plenty of work to do. And so we've been doing this in Guinea for several years now. Biotope is actually a consulting firm based in France, which was created nearly 30 years ago. And so we've been very busy working with our partners and stakeholders and the government in France in implementing best practice in how to manage biodiversity impacts from development projects. And over the past decade, we've played a growing role in trying to also disseminate the lessons we've learned doing that to other countries. And Guinea was a really interesting experience in doing this. And so with funding from the French Development Agency, from FFEM, from the MAVA Foundation as well, and several other partners, we started implementing this combo project in 2016. to try and broaden the application of good practice in biodiversity management. To cut it short, I'm just going to give you a rapid timeline. At the time when several large mining projects were in the works, a workshop was organized in Conakry, the country's capital, and the French Development Agency was there together with several other key partners interested in the conservation of the country's biodiversity. And this is where the discussion on how to use private sector resources to fund improved management of protected areas in Guinea began, and this then led to the Combo project, which started in 2016. In 2017, we were able to establish a national committee, which was created by decree and which provided the country with a platform in which to develop a national strategy on how to adopt good practices in biodiversity management, namely the mitigation hierarchy that Ray mentioned in his introductory talk. So the requirement to first avoid impacts, then reduce or minimize impacts that you couldn't avoid, of course, remediate or restore temporary impacts, and any residual impact that remains, and there often, if not always is, of course, especially when you're talking about large projects such as large mines or dams, then you need to do something about it. And Guinea in particular needs to do something about it, as we'll see. And so this is where offsets come in as something on top that has to be really thought through. And so we were able to work with the government, with civil society, with industry also in having all of those conversations about the right way to do that. This national strategy on mitigation and offsetting, of course, doesn't ignore the financing questions. And in fact, it lays out the necessity to work with the private sector so that their offset resources, the funds, the capacity that they allocate to offsetting their residual impacts is well used and used to improve the condition of biodiversity in the country and the country's protected areas. And this is how we're now in 2021, and we're currently working on the feasibility of a national conservation trust fund whose purpose is going to be to provide industry with a more readily usable, accessible system so that they can actually manage those resources allocated to biodiversity through their offsets for long-term success. So we're still doing the feasibility study for this, but I think it provides a useful case study for the discussion that I hope we'll have. So this feasibility study is actually implemented by Biotope and several partners. We're doing this for the Ministry of Environment as part of the implementation of the country's strategy on mitigation and offsetting. And it's funded by the World Bank as part of a bigger project whereby the World Bank is actually going to fund capacity building in Guinea in the mining sector and the conservation sector, again, to try and make these two very important sectors work together. And the context for this is that today in Guinea, some of the main funders of biodiversity are actually mining companies. This might appear as a surprise perhaps to some of you, but there is very little public funding from the Guinean government. There is some funding, which is significant, from international donors, European Union, AFD, others, but most of that funding comes through relatively short-term projects. And so there is a challenge to try and structure things so that they are effective in the long term. And in contrast to these more traditional conservation donors, what's interesting is that the mining sector often lays out its commitments for offsets with in the longer term. And this is particularly the case in Guinea for some of the mining projects that are funded by the International Finance Corporation. So there's two large mining projects there, bauxite projects that are funded by IFC. And as part of IFC's performance standards for biodiversity, there is a requirement that offsets be financed for the whole duration of the impacts. And so that really lays out the need to think about how you can structure the financing of those offsets so that they can be really long-term, several decades. That's a very big challenge, but it's also where conservation trust funds might provide a useful solution, given that conservation trust funds were designed exactly for the purpose of accessing and capitalizing resources that can then be used in the long term outside of a project by project approach. I'm not going to go into the details of what conservation trust funds are, but the idea is to move away from these short-term project approaches to funding restoration and conservation. And so we're having those conversations now with IFC, with the mining companies, also, of course, with the Guinean government and other stakeholders in finding the best way for a conservation trust fund to be attractive and useful for the private sector to respond to the needs of securing the financing of responding to what lenders are requiring, but also the liabilities that come with it, and also that it responds to the needs of the protected area network, which is really in poor shape. So I'm going to just mention a few challenges, but I hope we can have then some discussions on that. Ray mentioned the usefulness or the perspective, his vision that the overall cost of offsets should be included in the initial capital expenditures from, say, mining projects, so that the resources needed for those offsets are available at the start from the get-go, and that they can be placed in a conservation trust fund so that we know they're there, and that the day the digging begins or that the dam wall is closed, we know that the resources needed for the long-term management of the offsets are there, and that we are not, let's say, placing too much trust in the fact that the companies operating those projects are indeed going to pay year on year the management costs of those offsets. That's the theory. The reality, of course, is that in terms of the business model of a mining project or a hydropower project, that's not how they're designed. And instead, a large part of the long-term financing of offsets is taken from operating budgets. And of course, that makes sense from the business perspective. But so we need to discuss where do we find the middle ground for that, and what are the elements of the offsets that need to be secured from the start, or what part of those costs shouldn't be dependent on the year-on-year success of a mine or a dam. That's a very important aspect. A second important aspect is if a mining company hands over all of the resources it has for an offset to a third party, such as a conservation trust fund, how does it ensure that its own liabilities or its own requirements towards its lenders or towards the Guinean government in this case, given that we were able to introduce an offset requirement in the new environmental code in Guinea, that's also risky for the company if its capacity to comply with its own requirements is dependent on a conservation trust fund being able to do its job well. And that's also a risk that has to be managed in the paperwork and the governance that is put in place. And then another criticism, perhaps that's up for discussion, is the risk that a conservation trust fund might have higher management costs because it's a specialized entity, because it's perhaps going to be more careful to monitor the good use of its funds in terms of the performance, say, of a protected area. It's going to have higher costs than if you're just opening an escrow account in your usual bank that you work with as a business. Those are three important questions for which we need to find practical solutions if we actually want a conservation trust fund such as the one we are building in Guinea to actually play the role that is intended for it, which is to access some of those massive amounts of resources that are going towards environmental destruction in Guinea to then actually be used to also conserve and restore some of the country's natural assets. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Fabien. Some great case studies here. This is where rubber meets the road. And so next, let's see. Yeah, so next up is Victor Giraldo, who's the Global Director for Biodiversity, Carbon, and Water at South Pole, and he'll be talking to us about Colombia. So.
Thank you. So I shall see what here and there. Okay. Okay. Got it. Then here. Okay, that's better. Okay, thank you for the invitation. And meanwhile, the presentation, it's good. I'm the Director of Project Implementation based on carbon and biodiversity and water projects in South Pole. I will talk to you about the experience of the biodiversity offset or biodiversity credits markets that we have been experienced in countries with regulations. And I will go through a specific case study of our biodiversity credit system in Colombia that is based on the specific regulation for biodiversity compensations based on ecosystem equivalences, and also the possibility to develop voluntary investment to generate net gains or biodiversity enhancement in the country, taking advantage of the current regulation. And also there is a country with a specific emission reductions regulation or carbon tax, for example. So it's an integration of different type of offsets on landscapes that will allow us to generate sustainability and in the communities, and also to support the private sector to comply with their obligations and also their voluntary investment. So I will talk to you about I call it the biodiversity in the nature positive roadmap. It's, you know, there is a strong growing of the carbon markets in the world as one of the main developer of carbon projects and mitigation solutions in the world. We understood the importance of connecting different type of ecosystem services and landscapes with their connected market mechanism or financial instruments. So I will talk to you about going beyond carbon markets. Give me a second. Okay. So meanwhile the presentation, it's okay. South Pole is an organization with experience developing and implementing environmental credits projects around the world and link them to a specific market mechanism or financial instruments like carbon offset, carbon credits, and in this case, biodiversity credits. We have more than 400 now employees, and we have impacts from all around the world. And we have between representation and offices, presences in more than 29 countries, and even projects in more than 70 countries where we are creating impact through the integration of our different strategies. What put us here, you know, now we have a twin crisis because climate mitigation and biodiversity laws, they have similar drivers of transformation. So when we are analyzing a landscape, we cannot separate them. No, this is mitigation or removals, and this is biodiversity, and they can live separately. No, we need to integrate strategies on landscapes that allow us to face this twin crisis. And it means integrated approaches that can create a bigger impact than isolated approximations on territories. That's why we created a roadmap Like what we need to integrate biodiversity, carbon, and other potential ecosystem services in the future. We need to start from measure those impacts. We need to go through identify which is the target on the specific landscape that we have. Every landscape is a different story. We don't have the same equation for everything. That's why we need to understand them and identify which targets we want to achieve there. Like in this case, emission reductions, removals, biodiversity net gains, enhancements. But then we need to identify the specific alternatives or strategies that we will implement on the ground. It could be a community-based project. It could be a private project. It could be a combination between public and private investment. And then we need to finance this. And in that finance process, we need to start to understand how markets are implementing these activities. So we know in carbon markets, there are carbon offsets, carbon credits that allow some additional incomes to these communities that are protecting or restoring the lands. But now we also understand there are countries with specific biodiversity compensations or offsetting regulations that we can also integrate into these specific activities. Then if we implement these activities following these specific country rules or market rules, we will want only to create impact. That is the main purpose, but we can connect that impact with markets and we can generate additional incomes for these communities or these specific projects in order to face one of the main challenges of all conservation activities or restoration activities, that is financial sustainability. And then we need to create or we need to follow international, national frameworks, transparent ones that allow us to communicate that information. Give me a second. No working. Can you please go to the next slide? So, sorry. We are applying the nature-based solutions concept to integrate our approaches on a landscape level. And we understand that this nature-based solution concept can be applied in different contexts. We are talking about compliance markets, where we talk about nature-based solutions for mandatory offsets, you know, carbon offset, biodiversity offset, as we have in Colombia, in Australia, and other countries that are creating this specific regulation. But we also have a broader spectrum of voluntary investment, how corporates, how philanthropies, how other organizations that are not obligated to compensate for the impacts are also interested in investing in biodiversity. And that's where we talk about nature-based solutions pro biodiversity investment. We talk about nature-based solutions for climate mitigation and for action. It means we want to integrate all these activities on the ground, all these types of projects on the ground to create impacts that can generate additional incomes. That is the summary of this initial. What is the approach? Nature-based solutions at landscape level. But now we'll talk to you about the biodiversity credit system that we are following in Colombia. And there's potential in those countries with a specific biodiversity offset regulation or regulation that allows the compensation of biodiversity impacts. So the biodiversity credit system is a strategy that basically channel investment to preserve and manage this specific lands through different conservation instruments. So it means we understand the land, we understand those landscapes, the specific conservation instrument that we can apply, and we put them into the specific credit system. What means our biodiversity credits, it's defined by the ecological value of restoring, preserving, or developing sustainable land management in a specific area. It could be an hectare, it could be per square meter. It also could be per species, depending on the specific country regulation. But this system will allow us to connect all these conservation instruments or activities on the ground to this specific valuation of how much cost to generate net gains applying these activities, and also in the case of the compliance sector, how to comply with the ecosystem equivalences compensation that they need to create. So we did it through the specific biodiversity credit unit to trade these specific services. It is an interesting mechanism because we always consider the type of ecosystem that we have, the values to be preserved, the type of communities that we have. It's not the same indigenous, Afros, or farmers, for example. So we need to understand the logic of the territories and the degree of the pressure of this ecosystem, how degraded, how deforested there has been historically, the scale and the legal framework, you know, the land tenure. In many of these projects, when there is a compliance market for offsetting, the land tenure is one of the critical elements in order to guarantee the permanence of the project. This is one of the key elements that we always need to incorporate in our solution. So the basic model for coal mining, infrastructure, and other organizations where they are trying to apply biodiversity offsetting, and it's like the basic operational cost. So implementation cost, and that's all. But a biodiversity offset or biodiversity credit is more than that. We need to design, we need to plan first. What is we going to do according to this specific landscape? We need to design the specific conservation instruments that we can apply according to the country regulation or the international framework that we are analyzing. But then we need to implement these activities and we need to monitor them to show transparently that we are already creating the enhancements, the net gains that we want to use, in some cases for voluntary investment and other ones for compliance. And we need to create financial sustainability of this process. So the amount of money that we want to guarantee to keep that projects alive won't depend only, in our case, of the compliance organization or the voluntary buyer. We are analyzing the landscape to connect these initiatives with other potential markets, like carbon markets, like payment for ecosystem services related to water. The idea is like commodities, like sustainable commodities production, because the idea is the project owner through time can generate additional incomes, and then the opportunity cost to do something not sustainable or not positive with the environment can be lower. So as much as we can value the different ecosystem services and we can connect them to market mechanism or financial instruments, it will be less like interesting for the farmers, for the indigenous, for the communities to destroy those ecosystems. And this is a key element when we design these credits or these offsets, the financial sustainability through time that can guarantee the project permanence. Then this is like an example of different indicators that we analyze. We have a matrix of more than 50 indicators. Now they are based on a specific country regulations and some international frameworks, but they are based on composition, structure, and function. So behind that, there is science. There are experts, there are biologists, there are anthropologists, there are botanists, there are different experts developing this matrix in order to properly quantify what means an enhancement, what means a net gain, what means an avoided deforestation, what means creating removals. This is the idea. So this is like the summary of the main activities that allow, for example, in countries like Colombia, to generate biodiversity credits or net gains, like restoration, forest conservation, and sustainable ecosystem management. There is also now a growing development of specific marine ecosystem credits or reef credits, for example. In Colombia has been explored, and they are also in Australia as part of their biodiversity offset market. So this is like, we already talked about this mechanisms for compliance and voluntary investment, and then you can see a landscape. You know, this nature-based solutions approach, you can take a landscape, and then you can start to identify the different potentials that you can find there. So some of the areas could be useful for avoided deforestation or forest conservation, but then those ones that integrate communities can be useful for sustainable land management. We can do agriculture, regenerative agriculture, agroforestry, silvopastoral activities, but all these elements through a robust and transparent monitoring, verification, and reporting system will allow us to quantify what are the net gains of implementing these activities. Then for biodiversity, if we quantify them, we can monetize that through this specific pricing exercise of the biodiversity credit. But for carbon, it could be the carbon offset. Yes, and for sustainable commodities, so we can have cocoa sustainable production. But then you have a landscape with different elements integrated, because this is the idea. And in other cases, they are called escapes, because the level of intervention is higher. But we need to connect those escapes into these specific landscapes approaches that allow us to connect that. This is the way that we manage the different offsets into our biodiversity credit system. Next slide, please, because it's again. Great, okay. This is the summary. So you can have biodiversity credits. You also can implement offset, but this specific approach, we want to create biodiversity enhancement, because they could be for compliance, that could be for voluntary investment, but we need to go through it. But one of the specific elements or unit that we are using to trade that are the biodiversity credits. And these biodiversity credits are based on those specific activities that I mentioned you before. And those specific activities can generate other co-benefits, you know. Implementing a biodiversity credit strategy will have carbon as a co-benefit. And that carbon now has a specific market mechanism that we can sell it through carbon credits, but also can be water. And when we can develop pricing or payment for ecosystem services related to water, or other type of environmental credits that we can quantify and we can generate additional incomes or benefits. And of course, the social biodiversity strategy, every landscape approach, it won't be successful if the design doesn't consider the communities and doesn't consider the landowners for such a specific design. That's why we talk about conservation instruments. That's why we talk about different elements that we can implement on the ground. So this is as I mentioned, voluntary standards. There are also standards that are considering biodiversity indicators. Then you can use them if you want to make more transparent your process. Then you can use that frameworks to monitor or to select how to verify the positive impacts on your specific biodiversity credit system. So we are considering some of all of these ones, but probably there are more in the world. What happened in Colombia? Colombia is a hub for carbon markets and biodiversity markets. As the approximately 40 countries in the world, Colombia is one of the countries with a specific biodiversity offset regulation that is called biodiversity compensations through ecosystem equivalences, but it's also a country for carbon pricing. Then that carbon pricing can generate offset through the specific forest conservation, avoided deforestation, removal generation. So we now have a specific portfolio of projects that allow us to combine biodiversity plus carbon. This is one example of a project that is issue carbon credit to a RED Plus project. And in the non-eligible areas for the RED Plus project, we are developing we register an avid banking project as well to issue this specific biodiversity credits. Then these communities will perceive additional incomes for the sales of carbon, but also for the sales of biodiversity in a voluntary market, but also in a compliance one. So a gold mining infrastructure, oil and gas company obligated in Colombia to compensate can buy these specific credits. This is like how the project is designed. It has a RED Plus, Avid Bank, and a payment for ecosystem services related to our resources. So we are trying to generate sustainability. The other example is a landscape approach that is integrated also, a RED Plus project plus biodiversity credits for compliance market at biodiversity offsets for the mining sector in this region, but also the production of sustainable cocoa for national sales and also international sales. So now we have a landscape that is integrated different elements, not only carbon, not only biodiversity, but also sustainable commodities production. This is the way that we integrate these elements. And it's one of the pilot projects of the landscape standard of PERA. So just to finish, this is an example of other biodiversity projects that we have in Colombia, you can click and see the story maps through the presentation that will be shared. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor. Sorry to cut you short there. We just we're time. We have one more presentation, and this one from Sean Nazarelli. He'll be doing it remotely, so unfortunately you'll need your headphones to hear him. And Sean is based in Mozambique, and he's the innovation director for BioFund. And just want to remind everyone, please don't walk away with your headsets because they only work here anyway. So please leave them here. We have to clean them. And then at 11:15, we have a session on conservation trust funds in the central stage there. And then we also have, of course, as you know, probably pretty full schedule of events here throughout the next 4 days. So thank you for joining. And I think we're over to Sean now, if he's on. Yeah, excellent. Have a great day.
Yeah, thanks very much, David. I'll try to be as brief as possible and talk about the concrete aspects of how offset financing is working for protected areas in Mozambique. Just very quickly, right at the beginning, BioFund, who we are and where we are. Mozambique's down in the southeast corner of the African continent. BioFund is a foundation in Mozambique. Essentially, it's the conservation trust fund for the country. It's an independent institution with an endowment fund and currently implementing nearly $30 million worth of projects and supporting most of the protected areas in the country, both publicly and privately managed. We're actively involved in exploring new and innovative financing schemes for biodiversity conservation, particularly biodiversity offsets. We've been working for a number of years now, even before the existence of the Combo project, and then as one of the countries in Combo and working with WCS on that. As Fabian talked about the need for conservation trust funds in Guinea, we are already playing that role in Mozambique. The protected area system in Mozambique, it's about 26% of the country, both terrestrial and marine, although the marine side is significantly lower in terms of its percentage coverage. I won't go through this, just this little graph at the bottom showing that roughly 80% of the financing for biodiversity comes from external sources, therefore needing desperately to increase the amount of money coming. That's the mining map of Mozambique. As you can see, it covers most of the country except the protected areas. So there's obviously a great opportunity here for offsets to play some of that role. Legal framework, we've been working on it for a number of years. There's a legal requirement for large projects to do offsets if needed since 2015, but the legal guidelines on how to do so is only being published right now. As Aurélien referred to, it's really important, and this indeed does follow international best practice and has been widely consulted amongst all the major stakeholders. And it's focused here on the protected area network. So it's really looking at trying to restore degraded areas inside protected areas or inside key biodiversity areas in the country. So here, luckily, every 5 years, companies have to renew their environmental license, and they will then also be required to update their offset management plan, looking at the actual results achieved. And a developer may choose to implement it directly themselves, or may choose to use an intermediary. I think some of the questions that Fabien raised about why one should choose a conservation trust fund as an intermediary can perhaps be reflected on. And CTS had a great deal of value as intermediaries for this system, as both a matchmaker between project developers and biodiversity implementers on the ground. They have a specialized knowledge and a focus on biodiversity, something that most companies do not. They have financial management procedures and oversight structures in place on how to manage grants. Again, something is totally alien to most companies. We have specialized monitoring and evaluation services. We can increase transparency over how those resources are being used, and thus increase the reputation and probably the believability of that offset. Now, I'm going to focus here on actually what is the actual financial mechanism. It seems this session was requested to talk about the financial mechanisms for biodiversity offset. So here, the way we're structuring it right now is that the offset developer will require to have a biodiversity offsets management plan, and will have to relate a budget for this and have to produce a budget specifically on what they're going to do for it. If they choose to offset through a conservation fund, and I'll just talk about that option right now for the sake of time. If they choose to do it that way, then the Conservation Trust Fund will help find the offset implementer and will help work on make sure we have conservation outcomes. Oh, sorry, I believe you've crashed. Hello?
Sean, I can hear you, but.
Yeah, I just got a message that the computer had crashed.
Oh, great.
So, they're restarting it.
All right.
So I might as well shut up for a bit if that's what's happening.
Okay, well, hopefully it'll get started again.
Yeah.
Are you back in Mozambique now?
I'm back in Mozambique, yeah.
Okay.
I perhaps should have gone to Paris, actually, to be honest, but given the number of people that are there. But anyway, are we back up now?
And I couldn't go, so.
Yeah, I saw.
Yeah.
You got stuck. Let's see, I guess I'll wait until someone says
It said we can hear,
again.
so that's good. They just can't see. Got a note here, we can hear.
Okay, so I guess if we can, we can hear is those are the participants online. I think the online participants can hear. And what happened is the computer they're using to, sorry, for all the online participants, I just received, the reason I stopped here in the middle of this was that I just received a message from the organizers saying that the computer they're using in the room in Paris, in Marseille, has crashed. And so I was asked to stop. Sorry, I didn't realize all the people online are still able to hear me. So I'm just having a brief pause here until I get another message saying that they're back online. And then I will see where they want me to go backwards to. Okay, so just bear with us a bit. As always in these mixed events, there's a significant amount of technical difficulties that need to be overcome before we can actually present the content. I suppose, in fact, did anyone have a question? I don't know if you guys can raise hands. I could answer a question or two from anyone who's online while we're waiting for the system to go back up. I can see messages. So maybe you just type a message to us if someone wants to. I think I'm allowed to, it looks like I'm allowed to turn people's microphones on. So if someone does want to ask a question, just put a note in the chat and I'll turn you on. Okay, it appears that it's reconnecting. Hi, Kumar, are you back online now?
Yeah, Sean, we are. This is David.
Hi, David.
But we're just doing a few Q&A. So just keep yourself on mute for a sec, and then we'll have.
world, and especially I think typically it's the case in Guinea or Mozambique. That's the way it's currently happening. So you have a project, they are seeking finance from a lender, so they have to demonstrate that the project will comply with biodiversity standards, and as part of those standards, there is a requirement also to avoid, minimize, restore, and offset. And impose on their clients. Habitat banking is a really good solution to avoid situations whereby you allow the impact on the basis that the restoration for offsetting is going to be carried out. But even if you require the enabling conditions, the restoration will still only happen once the permit is granted, right? So you are allowing the impact on the basis that on the promise that the subsequent restoration is going to be carried out. Habitat banking has this virtue that you wait for the restoration to have proven that it's effective before allowing that restoration to be used to offset an impact. And so you're reversing the order. You're doing the restoration first and then the impact. Whereas what most people do is the opposite. First you impact, and then you need to wait for the restoration to happen with all the uncertainty that carries. So that's a really important distinction. We didn't really go into that, but I think what South Pole presented is the habitat banking model. What I presented was about securing the finance so that we knew the resources were there, but you still haven't done the restoration. Well, who knows what Sean is going to tell us. Is he back? Yeah. Okay, so that was the first question. Sorry, it was a bit long. And maybe you can ask the second question again once we're back. Yeah. Do you want to go? Okay.
Hello, I am back now. I'm not sure exactly where it dropped off, but I will just focus on the key message of this, or the key bit here that I wanted to talk about, which was the actual financial mechanism that we've designed for how a CTF can be involved. I was speaking a little bit beforehand about the added value of trust funds for being involved in offsets, but I'll skip that bit if you didn't hear it. So in Mozambique, the way we're looking at trying to structure this is as follows, which is that the offset developer has to produce what's called a biodiversity offsets management plan, and we'll have to have a budget for what it wants to do in there with very clear actions designed and specific concrete results. If they choose to offset through a conservation trust fund, and that's not required, but will probably be easier for them to do so, then that fund would help them find the offset implementer and help them negotiate the implementation arrangements in order to get specific and concrete conservation outcomes. Now, the financial mechanism will work as follows, which is in the very first phase, which is the sort of the startup phase, will be funded through sort of sinking funds or funds through a project model. Then the initial implementation for the first couple of years, depending on exactly what the implementation activities are, where you'll be really monitoring financials against the work plan submitted. So you're really sort of looking at inputs here at this stage. Again, this would be funded through sort of sinking funds or a project cycle kind of model coming into the trust fund on a regular basis, and the trust fund doing the financial monitoring to make sure that they're actually implementing the activities that were designed. Phase 3 is when we start moving towards a results-based payment model, where now we're going to look at the physical financial monitoring against the implementation goals of the biodiversity offset management plan. This is probably in, say, year 3 to 5. Again, that's dependent on the kind of implementation activities that will take place. But we're now looking and we're starting to measure outputs. So then there would be some external performance assessments really from the third year on to make sure that actual outputs are being achieved. Again, this would be sinking funds coming into the trust fund on a regular basis, based now on the results that are coming out. At the end of the fifth year, there needs to be an external performance assessment, and that's before the environmental license is renewed and the environmental management plan is updated and approved again. At which point you then start moving on to, again, you look at what's happening, and depending on the interventions needed, we might now have actually achieved the initial restoration goals. And now we're starting to look at maintenance of results and consolidating the protected area authority. So now we start, instead of just evaluating the outputs on a project basis, we now start looking at the impacts, and we start evaluating impacts. At this point, we start doing results-based payments based on impacts. And this would then be possibly, hopefully, funded through an endowment fund, in which the company would then put in a large amount of money in that would allow the financing of those activities to take place for the next 20 or 30 years, or preferably in perpetuity, in order to guarantee that that you have maintained the biodiversity gains that have been achieved. So that's the structure we've put together, how you can use a trust fund, how you use the added value of a trust fund all the way through this process, helping a company to achieve and meet its biodiversity offset obligations. So I'll stop there. That's my email at the bottom, along with my colleague, who's the offsets coordinator here at BioFund, if there are any questions. I'm not sure if we have time for any specific questions now, but thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks, Sean.
Could you hear me, everyone there? I'm not hearing anything from David in Marseille.
I can't hear anything from Marseille either.
Thank you, Sean. This is Kumar. David is currently setting up the next session, but thank you so much for the presentation. So if there are any more questions from the audience, we would love to hear them. So I'm actually going to bring the microphone to right over here. Here you are, to Marianne, please.
Je parle en français ou en anglais? In English? Yes. I have a question. I was wondering whether the developers well, in order to support a project, for instance, in Southern Africa, are they obligatory to be based in Southern Africa? Or it can be, for instance, a French company supplying funds for in Southern Africa, for instance, for community-based project. I don't know if the trust fund has to be, well, the companies have the obligation to compensate for project in their countries, or it can be anywhere else in the world.
Sure, yes. So we're going to take a few questions at a time so that we can get to answering them all. So the next question, please.
Hello, my name is Caroline van Leenders from the Ministry of Agriculture and Nature from the Netherlands. And I was wondering what the interest of the private financial sector is for these kind of schemes. Do you see a growing interest? What kind of players are interested to invest also in these kind of habitat banks, etc., and funds?
Thank you so much. And so we'll take one third question, and then we'll let the panelists answer to the best to their abilities. Here you are, Mario.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to ask, this is more in a middle between a question and a consideration. Don't you think that the people who live in the land that needs to be protected should be more the protagonist of our conservation activity, and that it could not be asked to people to leave their land or stop farming for preserving, but rather that it will be needed to implement new techniques and different techniques for farming the same land, for preserving it, finding nature-based solutions. And second of all, somebody asked before if biodiversity offsets are not a way of subtracting the total amount of capital that it is available for conserving nature. But don't you think that the carbon offsets market should develop in the direction of creating carbon offsets which are not donation, which are not certification, but rather are a store of value, are a financial tool able to be profitable and to store the value that has been invested, passing from donation to investments, as they are the only guarantee of the preservation of our planet and our economy. Okay, I guess it is a kind of broad, but well, it is what came up after this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those questions. So if our panelists are able to provide any answers, so I will give the microphone to Victor. Yes, here you are.
Yeah. I will try to take some of the questions. The first one, due to ecosystem equivalences, if you are a compliance sector, you need to implement your project on the similar regions with similar ecosystems because you need to create this kind of similarities. But if you are a voluntary investor, because you want to support any biodiversity projects in the world, it's a different story. Then you can invest wherever you want. And the important thing is you can follow a rigorous process to demonstrate the outcome of your interventions, like enhancement, net gains, and these elements. So this is the second one. It's private sector. Indeed, you have compliance private sector and you have voluntary private sector. Indeed, there is a growing demand from private sector to be more involved on biodiversity strategies, funds, and some of there are, of course, compliance ones that need to offset their impact. This is the easiest part of the model, but the voluntary ones are interested in promoting better biodiversity management activities links to their supply chain, for example. So then they want to create more impacts on their supply chains related to biodiversity. But when you implement biodiversity, as I mentioned, the ecosystem services are not separated. It is a way that we try to account for them. But when you implement an activity to protect biodiversity, you are always avoiding deforestation, for example. When you are avoiding deforestation, you are protecting biodiversity, you know? So because they share similar drivers of transformation. That's why all these companies are growing in their intention to connect their climate targets with the biodiversity targets. And then I go through the third question. On my experience, maybe there are other experiences in the world. So first, when we talk about biodiversity credit system, we are not only talking about avid banking, we are talking about conservation instruments intended to develop in a pricing strategy to quantify how much costs us to protect, preserve, and restore these lands. And effectively, for your question, as it is not an environmental economic valuation of biodiversity per se, it's a pricing strategy. We will never capture the whole value of biodiversity. That is one of the limitations of the mechanism. But in many of our projects, we identified that carbon has been a driver of investment to protect biodiversity. And in countries with regulation, there are not the options for companies to reduce their investment in biodiversity because they are investment in carbon. It is not allowed because there is a question of additionality. You know, it is the logic of the ecosystem services analysis is, of course, you have a forest, you have an ecosystem, as much as you can value or develop a pricing strategies of different ecosystem services, that forest will be more valuable. It will be more important for the people. The opportunity cost to destroy them will be higher. And when we work with carbon projects in a landscape or sustainable commodities, the biodiversity investment is not reduced. In many cases, the specific investment for biodiversity came through the initial investment in carbon offsets, for example, on restoring, on avoided deforestation activities, and in compliance market, there is not the possibility that a company that invested previously in carbon can reduce their investment on offsetting their biodiversity impacts. This is like, according to my experience.
Thank you so much for the comprehensive answer. If any other panelists would like to also add on to anything that Victor was saying. Yeah, Fabien, please.
There is one to the last question, which I think is very important. I want to stress that while we discuss offsets as something very specific, it also faces the same challenges as conservation that's not funded by a firm on the basis of its impacts in terms of implementation. And so some of the challenges about working with local communities, about finding systems so that the biodiversity outcome is sustainable in the long term, that it meets social standards, all of those considerations that people are discussing actively in the broader conservation field, of course, also apply to offsets. But I would say that the fact that those offsets are being funded and are under the responsibility of these private sector entities that are not conservation organizations actually places them under probably more intense scrutiny in terms of their performance. The social standards that apply to the projects that have impacts and for which offsets are being designed, those social standards, they also apply to the offsets. And so, in fact, there is already a very significant set of requirements to make sure that the social impacts of any offsets are adequately managed. I'm not saying that the outcome, perhaps is always satisfactory, but certainly it's not something that's being ignored. It's actually something that's quite central, and more and more so in how these things are done. And so the conclusion from this is, I think the offsets are probably a good place to actually experiment with performance-based conservation, with outcomes that have to be quantified and for which there's going to be a lot of external auditing and checks and balances, and that's probably a good thing, and it should there should be plenty of cross-fertilization between offsetting and the rest of conservation.
Thank you so much. I would like to give the opportunity to maybe Ray or Sean to add in if they would like to.
Sure, thanks, Kumar. I think the one question about the interest of the financial institutions, I think, wasn't answered yet that well. I think that there is more of a movement now to try to explore different mechanisms that could be used, financial mechanisms used to fund some of these offsets. I think that if we could get the compliance market going, as Victor was talking about, I think some of those financial opportunities would emerge. But right now, many banks are requiring compliance with standards, as I think Fabien mentioned, IFC standards. requiring the mitigation hierarchy and then a net gain. So what's not happening, and I think this really does need to change, is that even though there are requirements for to be done, there's not a requirement for that funding to be made available, to be put into the project, at least some commitment to that funding ahead of time. So I think there really needs to be some changes in the way projects are financed, maybe some new mechanisms. Looking at the bond market could be an interesting debt financing for some of these offsets and mechanisms could be quite interesting and something that we need to explore. I agree with on that first question, I agree with the concept that yes, the impacts take place where the offsets take place with the impacts. But it's an interesting question because if, for example, what if there's a species and there's a migratory species that you could actually have an impact in your one country and then do an offset in another country where that migratory species spends a lot of time and improve that habitat? Would that be a useful offset? It's sort of a theoretical question, but it's one that I think has arisen before. And I don't think anything's been done like that before, but you could see a linkage between habitats that might make that quite interesting. So just that one other point. There are some questions I think here on the chat, but I'm not sure what's our timing like, Kumar?
Unfortunately, we are quite over the allotted time.
Okay.
So we will not be able to get to the questions on the chat at this time.
Okay.
Yes. So
Great.
Yeah, I think I'm going to wrap up the session then in that case. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you to our panelists, and we do apologize for the slight technical difficulties that we had, but thank you so much. And I hope you come back and come and witness a few more Conservation Finance Pavilion sessions. And I wish you a very good day. Thank you all.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
And please, for the participants in person, if you could just leave your headsets on the seat so that we may collect them after, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye. Thanks, Sean.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for the session.
Okay, bye-bye.
Alors moi, je suis intéressée parce que on a fait aussi.